Hello, and welcome to today's special webinar event on the state of global security. Today's webinar is sponsored by Crowdstrike and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things that you should know about the webinar. So first off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you're going to find that we're offering several resources. And the main item that I want to call your attention to is the 2022 Global Threat Report from Crowdstrike. So that's the report that we'll be talking about throughout today's event. And I'd highly recommend grabbing a copy now so you can find more detail on a lot of the things that we're discussing. There's also a link to the Guerrilla Guide Book Club, which is Actual Tech Media's great collection of printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Event Center where you can find details on more events like this one that are coming up. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the drawing. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we do have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's great content. I'd like to welcome John O'Neill, who's Chief Information Security Officer at Molded Fiberglass in Northeast Ohio. Great speaker, presenter, holds a number of certifications. John, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be here with you and the great folks from Crowdstrike, and I'm excited for all of our attendees to go over things today. There's a lot going on in the cybersecurity arena, so I'm looking really forward to this discussion today. I'm sure it's going to have a lot of great content, and I look forward to learning stuff because I learn stuff every time we get together.
Super. Yeah. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and sort of what you do on a day-to-day basis as a CISO as well?
Well, so thank you for that opportunity. As you mentioned, my name is John O'Neill Sr. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Molded Fiberglass Companies. We're a global manufacturing firm headquartered in Northeast Ohio. And I also, in my career, have had the opportunity to be a consultant and an author. I've worked on projects for everyone from the small local ice cream shop to multinational global Fortune 100 firms. And during that time, I've learned that a lot of these organizations share common concerns, common needs. They have to solve the same kind of problems. So just because it's large or small doesn't make it immune from the cybersecurity landscape. I've been honored to be a multi-year Microsoft MVP recipient, as well as the NEOSA CIO of the Year award. So I really love it when I get the opportunity to give back to the community. I believe that's part of the responsibilities of all of us. It's to help our peers and our next generation. We're all in this together. So that's a little bit about me. I am also a scuba instructor, and thus my octopus shirt. Putting a little ocean vibes with us here as we go on to this. And again, I'm just really looking forward to getting going here.
Very nice. And then I'm also delighted to welcome Jason Rivera, who's Global Director of Strategic. He's a director of the Senior Director of the Strategic Threat Advisory Group Global at Crowdstrike. Jason, welcome.
Hey Scott, thanks for having me. Always kind of like John. We definitely look forward to having these kind of conversations I definitely also learn every time I do one of these, especially with other peers who are also briefing about what they're seeing in the threat landscape. And I think, of course, now, given what's going on in the world, having these kind of conversations is particularly relevant so we can maximize the preparedness of not only the audience, but each other collectively as a security community.
Absolutely. We're really going to get into what's going on in the world. That's great. And I wonder, Jason, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, so I lead a team at Crowdstrike called the Strategic Threat Advisory Group. And basically, the job of our team is to help our customers understand threats, but also more importantly, what can they do about the threats? What are the best ways to leverage both technology and process in order to be proactive in how we deal with some of these emerging issues that are happening throughout the world? Prior to CrowdStrike, I used to work for a big four consulting firm where I used to build threat intelligence programs for different types of Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. That's where I really got a kind of a wide perspective of, whether it's like the energy sector or financial or government, healthcare. Doing that previous role allowed me to adopt the perspectives of a variety of different industries, which in turn really helps me with what I do here, especially when it comes to the responsive element of how to deal with threats. And then prior to that role, I was in the Army for about 7 years, where I was an intelligence officer at places like the NSA and Cyber Command. And for me, that role really helped me understand the offensive mindset. So that's sort of my foundation, is thinking like an offensive-minded adversary, thinking about how to get into different environments, how to achieve various effects. And from that point in my career, I've been able to kind of turn that around and also think of it from a defensive standpoint since I'm now in the private sector. So definitely looking forward to sharing my knowledge with you guys and seeing where this goes.
Awesome. All right, great. So we've got this great event planned for you today. And the foundation of our panel discussion today is that CrowdStrike 2022 Global Threat Report. And this is a fantastic resource that, again, you can find in your handouts tab. But a lot of the interesting things that you'll hear about today, you'll be able to find often in more detail in the report itself. And I'll start off with a brief overview of some of the interesting data points from CrowdStrike's report, especially a recap of what happened in 2021. And then we'll look at 2022, what's happening so far, what's a continuation of trends from 2021 and what's more of a surprise. Then we'll go through 9 recommendations for CISOs for 2022. And these are coming straight from this CrowdStrike report. Although if you're following along in the report on pages 27 and 28, you'll see we've changed the order of the recommendations just for the flow of our conversation here. But so for some of those, we'll be leaning on John's sort of day-to-day experience as a CISO. For others, we'll be hearing more from Jason about his experience as well as solutions from CrowdStrike's portfolio that sort of map with those recommendations. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A portion where we'll address as many of your questions as we can. So, enter those in the console as often as they occur to you. And like I said, we'll get to as many as we can. So let's kick off with some of the fascinating details about the global threat landscape in CrowdStrike's report. And I'll be going through this, but Jason and John, please jump in if you'd like to add, some observations on any of the points. I'm a technology journalist, and I'll say I'm a good summarizer, but you guys are the security experts, so everybody wants to hear from you. So what you're looking at here is a blow up of a graphic in the report about the adversaries that CrowdStrike is tracking. Now, as someone who's covered major zero days and global security incidents over the years, I've been aware of adversaries behind different malicious activity. But if you'd asked me to guess before I read this report, I would have thought that there were maybe, a few dozen sort of named adversaries out there. But CrowdStrike is tracking more than 170, adversary groups that they've identified. What's more is that the numbers of significant adversaries on the global scene is increasing. The company added 21 in 2021. So just to give some examples of the kinds of activity that get classified as an adversary, here are some of the new groups that emerged in 2021 from the report. And before I do that, just a shout out to CrowdStrike's art department, which does a great job of personalizing these threat actors and making them easier to think about with great illustrations. And you'll see that throughout the presentation today. But one of the new ones was Wolf as a designation for targeted intrusions emanating from Turkey. Another one was Ocelot for intrusions emanating from the country of Colombia. And they also track what they call private sector offensive actors, such as hackers for hire, known as NSO Group and Kandiru. And Jason, I'd like to stop here to ask just what's sort of the level of activity that's required to identify a new group as significant enough to track? How do you guys differentiate between, the hypothetical kid causing problems from his basement and a serious global actor?
Yeah, one of the reasons that CrowdStrike tracks actor groups as opposed to malware or just TTPs is that you're really on the other side of the equation as a human adversary. And the objective as a defender is not just to understand what does the ransomware do, what does DDoS look like, what are the TTPs, but rather what is the holistic nature of the operation. Because when you're going to be attacked, it's never going to be just one thing that's going to happen to you. There's going to be a series of different things stringed together, used by the adversary in order to achieve their desired effects. So when we say an adversary, what we're really talking about is a combination of a variety of different characteristics that comprise what we would consider to be a whole adversary. The first thing is motive. So why are they doing it? What is the purpose? Is it a financial motive? Is it motivated by espionage, national security? And the different motives will drive different types of targets. Another thing would be the type of malware they're leveraging. So I like to think of malware as sort of the weapon. When you think of an adversary and the types of weapons that they are leveraging, whether it's weapons that are designed to have destructive effects like ransomware or wipers, or weapons that are designed to have more of kind of like espionage effects like remote access tools, different malware capabilities are designed to achieve those different motives. And then there's also TTPs. So how are they using the weapons? How are they moving laterally? How are they engaging in privilege access? How are they achieving persistence? And then the last thing that we really look at is infrastructure. So where are they coming from? From what IP addresses, from what domains, what type of infrastructure are they using? How do they leverage the dark web or not leverage the dark web, depending on the adversary itself? So really it's that combination of characteristics that we combine together to have a more complete picture of what we consider to be an adversary.
That's really interesting. And TTP, that stands for?
Tactic, technique, and procedure.
Got it. Thank you. Um, and I mentioned a couple of the actors there. Anything interesting, else from your perspective in 2021 as far as those adversary groups? Was there anything that you were tracking that was especially alarming or?
I think one of the more interesting observations from my perspective is the kind of what I'm calling the hybrid threat, where you have a nation state actor, but that same nation state actor is sometimes engaging in what would usually be criminal activity. So, for example, there's an actor that we refer to as Pioneer Kitten, which is an Iranian actor who's using ransomware at the behest of the Iranian state, but to achieve destructive effects. Or sometimes we'll see some of these nation state adversaries, like, for example, the Chinese set of adversaries, which we refer to as Panda. They like to leverage an adversary set called Wicked Panda, which their day job is as a nation state contractor designed to achieve access as well as steal intellectual property. But then we also observe that same actor engaging in criminal behaviors to include ransomware as well as some other types of fraudulent behavior. So this is something that I would say is characteristic of a lot of the major adversary nation states, the major nation state adversary sets, particularly within Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And we continue to notice that trend more and more. I think you're also even seeing that now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of what Ukraine is being hit by right now still resembles ransomware. So, things that you would normally associate with criminal capabilities, but appear to be being used in the course of a nation-state conflict. So I'd say that's one of the more prevalent things that I personally observed in 2021.
Great. Yeah, let's drill back into that 2022 stuff here in a minute. I'd like to hear a lot more about what's happening in Ukraine, what you guys are seeing. So this is another blow up of a really interesting data point from the report. And this one is about adversary tactics. And the report notes that attackers are increasingly attempting to accomplish their objectives without writing malware to the endpoint. Rather, they've been observed using legitimate credentials and built-in tools, an approach known as living off the land, and deliberate effort to evade detection by legacy antivirus products. Of all the detections indexed by CrowdStrike Security Cloud in the fourth quarter of 2021, 62% were malware free. And John, I'm just wondering, is that something that jives with what you're seeing or hearing from colleagues as far as the way attacks are coming?
Absolutely. What we've seen in our analysis and other analysis of large commercial organizations is that one of the most common attack vectors of the last few years, continuing currently, is through identity management breaches, right? So credential breaches, that kind of thing. And it's odd when you think about it, because historically, I mean, you go all the way back to guys like Kevin Mitnick, who social engineered their way into networks and that sort of thing. It's the same kind of concept as, hey, if I can get access through an existing credential and then use different techniques to elevate privileges or crawl the network and that kind of thing, as you mentioned, the more I learn of the network and of its people and how they conduct business and who they conduct business with and everything else before I launch even my ransomware or whatnot, it helps that attack be more targeted and increase the likelihood that attackers can create the false sense of urgency that they often try to create. I mean, one of the common stress points that we see after a ransomware event in a commercial organization is a push-pull between the cyber insurance carrier, who's like, hey, you need to let our forensic teams come in. They're going to negotiate the ransom. They're going to do all this. But if the threat actor has done, significant research and whatnot, they're pressing on pain points, like putting at risk strong customer relationships that might affect the company years down the line, even after the recovery. We recently saw a attack take out a supplier to Toyota, well published. They shut down Toyota 14 different facilities, caused them to not build over 13,000 vehicles. Even though that supplier was brought back online, the likelihood is that has damaged that relationship that will have financial and possibly operational impacts many years from now. And so we're seeing the threat actors try and leverage that so that they can create a false sense of urgency on the attacked, and even create that stress between the attacked and their insurance carrier, their forensic teams, right? They're pushing them, you're moving too slow, you're doing this, you're doing that. And it all works to the end of the attacker.
Great points. So I want to move on to another that I wanted to highlight out of the report, and this is an intrusion, a log of sort of interactive intrusion activity over time. And the way this is broken up is you have e-crime, and then state-sponsored intrusion activity, and then hacktivist intrusion activity, and then unattributed activity. And what Crowdstrike found was that financially motivated e-crime activity is continuing to dominate the interactive intrusion attempts that they've been tracking. And the e-crime accounted for nearly half of the observed activity, while targeted intrusions accounted for 18%. And hacktivists get a lot of attention, but hacktivist activity was responsible for about 1%. And the remaining 32% of attacks remain unattributed. And this was, pretty similar to 2020. And then one other thing that I wanted to get into here from the report was just something interesting about ransomware. And so CrowdStrike is finding that the overall number of operating ransomware families increased in 2021, and they found a 82% increase in ransomware-related data leaks, with 2,686 attacks for the year of 2021 compared to 1,474 in 2020. So those figures, coupled with other data leaks, highlight how valuable victim data is to adversaries. And then, John, one of the other highlights of the report involved Log4Shell and Log4j, and I'm wondering how has that been impacting your operations in either late in 2021 or this year?
Well, so there's a couple impacts that we've seen with it. The first impact is fairly obvious. So the IT team has to be redirected from the priorities that they already have facing them to deal with this technology, Log4j, this code that is embedded in so many different products, everything from Apache web server solutions, right, and to switches, to different appliances that are out there. And we've got to go find these things on the network. They tend to come from multiple different vendors, so you have to get a patch from them, and they're coming at different cadences, and you got to manage that entire thing. And so that takes away from the other priorities, right? And so you got to redirect the team and retask them. The second major issue is less apparent to a lot of my fellow IT pros, but it is the most important and apparent thing to the C-suite and the board of directors and their shareholders, and that involves cyber insurance and insurance in general. Why does anybody carry insurance? Or more specifically, why do businesses carry insurance? Because they're trying to offset, manage the risk to operations, right? They're looking at the overall longevity of the company, of the organization, and the ability for that organization to survive different types of events, whether it be fire, flood, physical damage, or a cyber event. And because there have been so many cyber events, you look at this slide and you look at what CrowdStrike is finding, insurance carriers are paying more than they ever have before, to the point where many insurance carriers, underwriters, are looking at this as something that they can absorb the risk for singularly. So they're treating it more like you would treat a hurricane, a typhoon, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, those type of events often have some government underwriting behind them to kind of shore up the insurance carriers to provide that coverage. That doesn't exist in the cyber insurance marketplace. It's all being borne by the commercial brunt of the carrier. So what are these carriers doing? They're putting more and more requirements on your policy. And one of the requirements that we're seeing from all of your top 5 global largest insurance carriers is a requirement that organizations disclose every Log4j instance in their organization, which many of those organizations may not even know some of them. And if you don't disclose them and you don't patch them and you have an event and the insurance company comes in, they have the right to not pay the claim. So you have an event, a ransomware event or whatever, and your total cost for that claim, including loss of business productivity, covering people's payroll checks during that time, right? Loss of systems that you had to rebuild and all that. And let's say it's $10 million, and your insurance carrier comes in and says, no, we're not paying off on it because you had appliances that we clearly stated in our requirements aren't there. And a lot of IT folks that I talk to are like, that's not fair. I don't even know whether a vendor used this or not. And the only thing I can tell them is that insurance companies, the last thing they concern themselves with is whether it's fair or not. So we're seeing a lot of discussion in the boardroom on that very topic of, okay, we're attesting that we don't have these things on our network. Is that true? Because when we have a claim, and many companies now kind of are working under the impression that, hey, we're probably going to have a claim sometime, right? We're going to have some sort of attack that affects us. And what they want to know is are we doing the best we can to minimize its impact? So when it does affect us, it affects as small a part of us as possible. And then are we putting things like cyber insurance in place that are going to help us cover those losses and get rid of those losses? And Log4j is a huge part of that discussion because it was a huge level, broadness wise impact, right? It pretty much impacted products from every vendor or software from every developer.
Those are great points about Log4j, in its implications for cyber insurance, and that's a really the point well taken as well on the ransomware insurance and how that differs from natural disasters in terms of government support. And Jason, before we sort of pivot away from the CrowdStrike report, sort of recap of 2021, anything else that you wanted to highlight from that year in terms of interesting developments?
Yeah, so I mean, regarding the slide that we're looking at, I think it's very important that cybersecurity professionals start thinking of ransomware less as a function of malware, but more as a function of extortion and coercion. And when you think about why the majority of victims actually paid last year, it actually, in many cases, had less to do with the malware and the encryption of the environment itself, and a lot more to do with the data leakages and the extortion and the ability to hold PII at risk. So the modern day ransomware attack will consist of more than just ransomware now. What you will often see is data exfiltration in the form of PII or taking sensitive email conversations, intellectual property, and they will use that data to apply additional coercive measures against the victim. And when you think about it from the victim's perspective, why does a victim pay ransom? It's not just because they got hit, because if you can recover tomorrow and get back to 100% immediately, well, then yeah, you wouldn't pay anything. But the reason a victim would choose to pay a ransom is because the impact of not paying outweighs the impact of paying. So, as defenders and as cybersecurity professionals, we need to start thinking instead about how will the adversary coerce me? Not only how are they going to lock up my systems, but how are they going to take the way that my data is organized? How are they going to take that and use that to hold me at risk? But then, more importantly, beyond what they're going to do, because that's only half the equation, what am I going to do? How am I going to make it to where it's harder for them, more difficult? How am I going to use DLP? How am I going to segment off my network? So on and so forth. I think there's a lot of strategies to think through, but in order to even begin to conceive of those strategies, it is important to get beyond the term ransomware and start thinking more holistically about what the operation entails, which is why, again, things like this global threat report, as well as threat intelligence, is useful for understanding that problem.
And hey, Scott, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in here because Jason brought up a really, really valid, important point. And that is for a lot of organizations, particularly commercial organizations that serve a particular customer base or that kind of thing, the information that could potentially be lost or exfiltrated could ruin their relationship. So I want to, you're the CEO of Big Co, right? And you service um, um, the largest automotive manufacturer in the world, and you're working with them on their next generation, super vehicle. And a threat actor gets in and attacks you, ransomware, malware, all these different things. But the biggest thing that's going to be at risk for you is that confidential data you have for that customer, that huge automotive manufacturer, gets exposed to the internet because 80% of your revenues come from that one customer. And if their next generation vehicle information, their engineering drawings and all that gets leaked out on the global internet, how likely do you think that big customer is to come back to you in 3 years and give you another contract and another contract? So now as a corporate executive or the CEO, you're sitting there thinking to yourself, if I don't pay this thing, I've got to replace potentially 80% of my business for my 10,000 employees within the next few years before this contract renews, or I'm going to be laying people off. I'm going to be closing plants. I'm going to be doing all these things, right? And so that's a huge concern, is not just that the threat actor has ransomed you, but what do they have out there and what is its potential impact to me, both individually, like Jason mentioned, PII, personally identifiable information for my employees and vendors, but as a large scale, because I can tell you that if you look at your profit and loss statement and you say, hey, a big chunk of my business comes from this customer, and you expose that customer's confidential data out on Facebook, out on whatever, they will not want to hear whatever explanation or rationale you give them. They'll listen to it, just like for those of us of a certain age, listen to the teacher's voice in the Charlie Brown cartoons that used to play, right? But it will have downstream impact that could be, life altering as far as your organization goes. So I think Jason brought up an amazing point that you have to think about it overall, not just what data is encrypted.
Thanks for adding that. Great points. And as far as the 2021 stuff goes, the report called out some incidents and trends out of Iran and China. But as we get into 2022, all eyes are pretty much on Ukraine. And Jason, I guess I'll turn to you first. What are you seeing in terms of, I don't know, cyber weapons spillover or increased ransomware attacks or anything out of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict, like many other conflicts, whether it's in the nation state space or the e-crime space, is very complicated and there's a lot of elements to it. And it's very hard to take these elements in separate parts and try to analyze them in of themselves. So what I mean by that is like you can't just look at the cyber by itself. The cyber is combined with the information warfare, which is combined with the physical warfare, everything used in conjunction and in cohesion. And I would say thematically, that is appears to be what we are seeing. Cyber effects used in support of kinetic warfare operations. So, for example, prior to invading a town with military forces, howitzers, troops, helicopters, whatever, seeing an information kind of operation to where they're maybe trying to demoralize the population, or maybe telling the population like, oh yeah, Zelensky surrendered. We're seeing cases where they're DDoSing critical Ukrainian communication capabilities. We released some reporting on how criminal actors are going after Ukrainian forums that are designed to share Russian military movements, or some criminal actors engaging in DDoS attacks against Ukraine websites where they're hosting information about Russian POWs. So certainly there is an information space element to this, but that is in support of the kinetic element. From a destructive standpoint, we have seen multiple malware variants, some of the ransomware variety, some that appear to purely be wipers, used in a very targeted manner to go after different types of critical infrastructure entities. Specifically, the critical infrastructure entities are those that are supporting the Ukrainian war fighting effort. So obviously the Ukrainian government websites. We're seeing attacks against transportation, attacks against telecommunications. The financial sector has been a big one. So really those five are where we're kind of seeing the most of the activity, particularly when it comes to Ukraine and Eastern Europe. But even beyond that, this conflict extends beyond the borders of Ukraine. Certainly, we're seeing an amplified amount of activity all throughout the world, especially against westernized targets. More specifically, we're seeing what appears to be Russian access development efforts against Western targets. And when I say access development efforts, think of it in terms of what an attack entails. Step one, gain access. Step two, post exploitation in order to move laterally and elevate privileges. Step three, objective execution. So in order for the ransomware or the wiper or the data theft to even happen, that's step three. In order for that to happen, the step one part has to happen first. And we're seeing that happen now. That is likely being done in preparation for potential retaliation, which could be retaliation for cyber stuff that's being done to Russia, or retaliation for maybe NATO support, like weapon support. And that's why looking at the whole thing is critical, right? If you're a cybersecurity professional right now, you can't just look at the ones and zeros. You need to look at who's getting bombed. You need to look at what NATO is doing, because all of that kind of stuff will serve as an indicator for what's going to happen within the cyber domain. I guess the last comment I have, unless there's other questions from you on this, Scott, but the last comment I have on this particular topic is the criminal and the hacktivist space. In my 15 years of doing this, I have never seen what I'm seeing now within the criminal and hacktivist space. And particularly, we're seeing galvanization of those two group types on both sides. So we're seeing criminal groups attack Ukraine. We're also seeing criminal groups attack Russia. There's a group that we refer to as Wizard Spider. You may know them better as the user of the Ryuk ransomware, or the Conti ransomware, or perhaps the TrickBot banking Trojan. Even within this group has been fractured, and now some of those group members are in support of Russia attacking Ukraine. Some of those group members are in support of Ukraine attacking the Russian members of the same group. So certainly seeing both sides kind of go at it. From a hacktivist standpoint, certainly a lot of patriotic hacktivist efforts, again, on both sides. Anonymous is all over the place. Anonymous, per usual, though, is very hard to quantify, because who is anonymous? I guess that's the whole point, right? It's a very dispersed group of individuals that don't really have a centralized identity. But from a centralized identity standpoint, we're seeing some Belarusian hacktivists engaging in attacks against the Belarusian state as well as against the Russian state. So yeah, certainly a lot of activity going back and forth within all three actor types, which is very rare. It's typically you kind of see focus in one area or the other, but everything is certainly firing at the full spectrum right now.
That's really interesting. I do have a follow-up question for you, and then I have one for John about this as well. But for you, I'm wondering, one of the things that's happened is, in the kinetic side, people expected Russia to quickly roll over Ukraine, just as far as like as a military force. Obviously, it's been a lot tougher than expected for the Russian military. But they also have a reputation on the cyber attack front as being very sophisticated and very good. Has anything been exposed about the effectiveness of the cyber weapons, or is it too early to tell?
I mean, I guess if I were to kind of look at the kinetic and the cyber elements of this, I think starting with the kinetic side, I think prior to the invasion, everyone expected, kind of like, I mean, to me included, by the way, I expected Russia to just completely roll over Ukraine within a matter of days. But I
Yeah,
think what a lot of analysts miscalculated was the will to fight. The difference between fighting for your own country from the Ukrainian standpoint, but then on the Russian standpoint, fighting for something that you're not even quite sure why you're there, which is what a lot of the Russian
sure.
POWs who are being captured are saying. From a cyber perspective, um, overall, I mean, I'm at least from what I'm seeing, Russia appears to be at their usual level of efficacy. And I think part of the reason that you're not seeing this broadcasted a lot in the open source is because there's not a lot of spillover like there has been previously. So
Yeah,
whenever we think of kind of like a Russia-Ukraine type conflict, everyone's minds immediately goes to not Petya, not Petya. Uh-oh, what if that happens again? What if there's this huge breakout with collateral damage? What I will
right.
say is that so far everything appears to be highly targeted and tactical. They appear to be hitting what they intend to hit, unlike what happened with NotPetya. So it's certainly happening. There's certainly a lot of activity, but I guess one of the reasons that it just might not be as notable right now because there doesn't appear to be a lot of the unintended spillover. That should not, however, be confused with the fact that there is a lot of intentional targeting that appears to be working very well. Again, like I said earlier, the amount of activity that I'm seeing across all three groups is unprecedented relative to what I've seen in the past.
Fantastic. Thank you for that context. That's really helpful. And John, my question for you is, there have been a lot of warnings coming out from CISA and other government organizations about what IT professionals need to be doing. Like what have your priorities been, and have you seen anything in terms of spillover or increased activity, attack activity on your networks?
So let me kind of take that in two parts. The first part, what have we been doing? Let me give kind of a little background of the why we've been doing it before I get into the specifics of what we're doing. So the why, from a high level, is that um, the risk to us that we're assessing is different than it ever has been before. So let me explain that. Um, in the past, we were concerned about malware and ransomware and threat actors, the hypothetical kid in his basement, all those different things. But we based our our analysis, our fear, whatever you want to call it, on a premise that they would be targeting us for something we had, some value we had for them, right? Whether the value be monetary, whether it be something else, confidential information, um, you know, espionage, any of those things, doesn't matter. There'd still be a purpose, kind of like a bank robber. If you're worried about bank robbers, it's because you're typically a bank. The ice cream
Right.
shop down the street doesn't tend to worry about a bank robber breaking it. The thing is with war, bombs are indiscriminate, right? We've seen that in the Ukraine. There's apartment buildings and hospitals, and sometimes they're bombed intentionally, as horrible as that sounds, to have an effect, psychological or otherwise. But other times they're just ancillary damage. But in any case, those people living in those areas have to be concerned about the potential of it happening. And that's the same kind of thing that we're looking at in terms of cyber attack. Is now um, we're discussing and addressing internally the concept of, hey, um, we have to worry about the bank robber even though we're the ice cream shop, because you know with the current state of offense and warfare, destruction is destruction. They really don't care that we specifically were targeted. They just care that the bomb went off. And so because of that, we have to expand what we've done to in the past to shore up defenses targeting targeted attacks, right? So if we're worried about control type, and I'm going to get really old here, but like Stuxnet type stuff that's targeting programming logic controllers or whatever, that's a very specific scenario and a very specific set. Right now, we're under the kind of scenario where we're like, hey, attacks could come from any vector at any time for any reason. Shore up every defense we have, right? So now we're going back through and we're making sure that, as simple things as departments aren't sending out emails with PII in them unintentionally, right? Social security numbers or that kind of thing. We're making sure that our all of our equipment has been updated with fully patched software. And when you've got, switches from 5 different vendors, firewalls from 2 different vendors, software from 100 different vendors, that's a monumental effort right there. And you're looking at it across the board. So you're doing all these things to shore up everything from old school type attack, trying to train people not to fall for phishing attacks, to very new scale stuff where you're leveraging technologies from CrowdStrike, cloud providers, whatever, to help analyze the attacks coming in. Now, to go to the second part about it, with increase in attacks, we have seen. Now, I can't definitively correlate it to Ukraine or Russia, but I can tell you that since February, when the attack, the physical attack began, we have seen a significant increase in the number of phishing attempts that are coming in, and the number of general port scans and hits against our firewalls and all those things, right? So things that you normally watch for, we've watched for years, but all of a sudden, coincident or not, since this thing has occurred with Ukraine and Russia, we're seeing, sometimes factors of up to 10 times as many attacks as we were back in January. And of course, Jason could probably speak more to that than I can, but that's definitely what we've been seeing.
Oh yeah, to add on to John's point, what John just said is consistent with what we are also observing. Increased scanning activity against network-facing devices, so firewalls, VPNs. This goes back to what I was saying earlier, access development. The objective for Russia, if I were Russia right now, if I were engaging in military planning, I would be seeking to gain access to Western targets so I could hold those targets at risk should things escalate. So that's how cyber operations in general work. You don't just snap your fingers and do something destructive. The access has to happen first. So honestly, one of my biggest recommendations for anyone listening who's concerned about what to do about this conflict is to behave as if it's happening right now, because it almost certainly is, especially if you're in a critical infrastructure sector, especially if you have certain types of intellectual property, certain types of connectivity to the, again, U.S. critical infrastructure, Western critical infrastructure. You are more at risk now than you have been in the past.
And that's a great segue into the next section of our session, which is 9 CISO recommendations for 2022. And this is from the CrowdStrike report. And the first one is really, what you guys were both talking about, protect all workloads. An organization is only secure if every asset is protected. You have to secure all critical areas of enterprise risk, enterprise and cloud workloads, identity, and data. So, I don't know that we need to say a lot more about that one. I think we were just covering it. And I'll move on to the second one, which is be ready when every second counts. Another one that, is especially relevant right now based on the conversation that we were just having. And John, I'd love your take on this one. As a CISO, how do you, balance the need to respond to things quickly, but then, also the need to, when you hear about things like dwell time, spending time and just rooting around in your systems to see if anybody is there. What's What's your approach?
Well, so, when I think about this recommendation, I think about discussions that I have almost every day. And those discussions center around urgency. And that there are differing levels of urgency. Unfortunately, what I've seen in the past and over years is that some of us in IT, we can be lulled into a case where, yeah, everybody's always telling us that what they need from us right now is the most important thing on the planet. The entire company is going to collapse if we don't do it. The sky will darken and everything will end because this printer isn't working, or I can't log on to my email, or those kind of things. Every request that comes in is super urgent, and it makes sense because whoever's calling, making the request, it's probably very, very important to them, and because it's very, very important, it's very urgent to them. But we in IT kind of got calloused to where we're like, yeah, we understand, and we would mellow, because the fact of the matter is no individual can be at 100% urgency all the time. It would break you down mentally, physically, all these different things, right? There's nobody I know that I could hire and say, okay, I'm going to put you at the highest level of work stress out there, and that's how you're going to operate 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for the rest of your career. It isn't going to happen because they're not going to stay around. So when we put that in a security perspective and the current event perspective, unfortunately, what we've seen over the last few years, actually, and you couple this with COVID and the switch to remote work for many organizations that weren't really doing that and all that kind of thing, is a lot of IT pros have been put in that place where they've been at that 100% stress level, hour after hour, day after day, that sort of thing. So now that we come back to them and we're like, hey, we're seeing this uptick in attacks. We're seeing a heightened level of risk. We're seeing changes in what we can be insured against. We need you to be ready when something happens, or that kind of thing. They're kind of looking at us with that, are you kidding me right now? Right. So as a CISO, we have to find ways to help them manage that, offload some of that stress, right? And give them bandwidth so that when disaster strikes, they have that bandwidth available to ramp up and respond. It's easy to say, be ready when every second counts. But if somebody has no bandwidth left in their mind, in their heart, and their capabilities, it doesn't matter. You're going to get exactly what they have right then and there, right? So we as CISOs need to be looking at what our team has available right now and trying to make sure that we do anything possible to give them bandwidth, because we need that bandwidth when the next level of the attack happens. Because as Jason said, it's my firm belief that it's happening all over right now, right? This is just the incubation period, if you want to put it in an analogy that way. But eventually the symptoms are going to break through and we're going to need to respond. And if we as CISOs have taxed all of our team so hard that they just have no gas left in the tank, then you're going to start to see a lot of negative results and successful attacks. So that would be my number one recommendation on this: is look at your team members, work with them, and make sure that they have some reserve left, or an extra gear left for when the event happens.
That seems really smart because you hear a lot about the shortage of security professionals, and everybody's teams are taxed, and you don't want to burn your people out. So these next three recommendations are for you, Jason. So let me just go through all three of them, and then I'll turn it over to you to cover the topics and map them to some Crowdstrike offerings with some slides. But so the next one is know your adversary. Number 4 is monitor the criminal underground. And number 5 is invest in threat hunting. So let me turn things over to you to talk about those.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. So let's go ahead and flip through. And I'm going to start with making a statement about what I believe to be the current state of the cybersecurity industry. The current state of the cybersecurity industry is very reactive. Right now, there is this overwhelming belief everywhere, and this is not necessarily 100% applicable, but in a large portion of the customers I talk to have a very reactive mindset. There is this belief that you will just respond, you'll respond to this alert, you'll respond to that incident, that you will just keep responding, and that somehow by responding, we're going to do the job and we're going to keep the adversary from getting out. And I want to say very clearly that that is not the case. If you are in a responsive mindset, if all you ever do is respond, then inevitably, one day, you will be subjected to strategic surprise. So our goal, I think, as cybersecurity professionals is to get out of this responsive mindset, which is really where the know your adversary piece comes into play. And I would challenge each and every one of you on this call today to commit yourself to answering the question that I have on the screen right now. And it's a two-part question, which is how exactly is the adversary going to attack you? And how exactly are you going to stop them? The irony of this question is that you will never 100% fully answer it. However, the more you commit yourself to finding the answer, what you will find is you will get to a place to where you are mentally on par with the adversary, to where you are watching their moves and you are able to use your understanding of their behaviors and their activities in order to inform your own behaviors. And what it really boils down to is that your ability to defeat an advanced cyber threat rests almost entirely on your understanding of the problem. And to illustrate that, I'm just going to give you a very simple example. What if imagine that you were about to go to war, you were leading an army, you had tanks and helicopters and troops. Could you imagine going into that war having zero idea what you're about to face, not knowing what the adversary was capable of? As crazy as that sounds, that is the general state of the cybersecurity industry. The general state of the cybersecurity industry is we just don't understand what we're getting into. Again, this responsive mindset, right? So that really is the purpose of threat intelligence. The purpose of threat intelligence is to commit ourselves to this understanding. And I would challenge you all to engage in two forms of threat intelligence. On the left, I have cyber threat intelligence. Think of that as the internal. On the right, I have digital risk monitoring. Think of that as the external. And our job as security professionals, and especially if you are a decision maker in the security industry, it is incumbent upon you to understand the adversary. Think of it like this. How will you make spending decisions? How will you make hiring decisions? How will you decide the organization and how you should be organized? How will you issue policy? How can you do any of that without really having a true understanding of the adversary? And that is why we have these two disciplines. Again, cyber threat intelligence for the internal and digital risk monitoring for the external. So let's go into some perspectives around cyber threat intelligence. In general, the purpose of cyber threat intelligence is to understand how is the adversary going to attack me? Remember that question that I asked at the very beginning of this portion? Exactly. How are they going to attack you? Not generally like, oh yeah, they're going to use ransomware and oh, the nation state guys, they're going to engage in espionage. No, exactly. Tell me how they're going to get in. Tell me how they're going to do post exploitation. What exact malware are they going to leverage? What are the hashes? What are the capabilities? How do the strings execute? It is that level of understanding that will lead you to the ability to have a high level of preparedness. And I would challenge us all to start thinking through these three adversary types that I have on the screen. The reason motive when it comes to adversary is so important is that the reason that you will be attacked is ultimately due to the motive of the adversary. Nation states have espionage related motives to go after national security related targets, economic security related targets, whereas e-crime adversaries have financial motives. They want to engage in ransomware attacks to extort you. They want to steal your data so they can commit fraud, whereas a hacktivist adversary has ideological motives. So again, it is incumbent upon you as a security professional to prepare yourself for that which you are most likely to face. And for you to understand what you're most likely to face, well, that's where threat intelligence comes into play. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit about how our Falcon X capability works. And the reason that I like our Falcon X capability is that it has a lot of automated features that integrate it with the endpoint itself. So for example, with the Falcon X attachment that goes in with our endpoint security capability, here's an example of how this could work. Let's say that a user receives an email, the email opens the attachment, your prevention capability quarantines the attachment. The nice thing about Falcon X is what it'll do is it'll automatically detonate it for you. So I'm just going to go ahead and load all these up. And the nice thing about having that quarantine attachment automatically be detonated for you is you're immediately figuring out about the adversary. Remember, our job is to understand the adversary prior to having to experience their full-on attacks. Your ability to quarantine content and rapidly detonate that content in a sandbox and learn about what the adversary is capable of is going to allow you to prepare for future attacks. A similar logic applies to IOC enrichment into the SIM. So right now, there is stuff happening in Ukraine right now. Iran is attacking different types of Israeli targets, different types of Middle Eastern targets right now. China going after different intellectual property targets right now. A similar logic applies to the criminal adversary types. And those attacks aren't necessarily geographically motivated. Those attacks are happening on a global basis. Everything is happening everywhere all at once. So from a threat intelligence perspective, your objective is to learn about what is happening in all these different locations and extract data that you can use to defend yourself prior to having to experience that attack. You notice that I'm going to keep on coming back to that term over and over again, your ability to understand something prior to having to experience it yourself. So for example, by having a good IOC feed, what you can essentially do is ingest that data and not only ingest it into a SIM, but a variety of your different cybersecurity tools. So for example, let's say you're a Crowdstrike endpoint customer. Great, you have made a fantastic decision by having Crowdstrike protect the endpoint. However, let's use intelligence to now protect our network devices, our firewalls, SIM, IDS, IPS, email gateway solutions. In general, you want to leverage intelligence content in order to push out your perimeter and strengthen your perimeter across all different types of devices. And lastly, there's an element around threat actor profiling. So remember what I said earlier, you are not just being attacked by a piece of malware, you are being attacked by an intelligent adversary who has a plan, who is engaging in a campaign, a series of sequenced steps designed to achieve a series of objectives. Your ability to understand those objectives, but then how the adversary is going to use different capabilities in order to achieve those objectives. How exactly will they gain initial access? Will it be through spear phishing? Or maybe it'll be like what John said earlier, perhaps an identity-based threat. Maybe they'll go buy your data from an access broker and then use that to gain access. Perhaps they'll take advantage of a zero-day vulnerability. Maybe they'll use a loader, whatever it might be, right? But your capacity to understand all of that in advance is what allows you to engage in proactive decision-making. Remember what I said earlier, especially if you're a decision maker, you are constantly making decisions about what to do next, about what to buy next, about who to hire, about which policies to issue. You're making decisions about how to advise your board. Your ability to make risk-based decisions based off probability and impact is premised upon your understanding of what is likely to happen. Threat actor profiling is one of the more valuable disciplines that you can engage in order to do that. Because here's the thing, it's not only about understanding the adversary, it's also about your ability to allocate scarce resources in the most efficient manner. Our most precious resource as cybersecurity professionals is time. Every time I talk to a customer, every single one of them underwater, not enough time, back to back to back meetings. Your ability to allocate your time correctly is premised upon your understanding of where to prioritize. Yet, if you do not understand the threat actors, if you do not understand what they're capable of, then how is it that you will prioritize? Because the challenge of not understanding is if you don't know what your priorities are, well, then I guess everything's a priority. But then if everything is a priority, then I suppose nothing is a priority. So again, think of threat actor profiling as your ability to prioritize and figure out what to do first, second, so on and so forth. So that was the internal side of the equation. Again, cyber threat intelligence is going to help you understand internally what is an attack likely to look like. The external side of the equation is digital risk monitoring. And for this, I strongly recommend the ingestion of a digital risk monitoring capability. Here is the challenge that most customers face. You know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. Here's what I mean by this. You are the expert of your own environment. There is nobody who knows your environment better than you. You know where the logs are. You know where the critical data is at. You know how the network is segmented. No one is better and smarter and more well-informed about your environment than you. However, the challenge is that the only way that you can learn about bad stuff without an intelligence capability is waiting for it to happen to you. So the purpose of digital risk monitoring is to help you understand everything external to your environment. There is a world of external threats that you should understand so that you can gain an advanced capability to defeat that threat when it comes to your doorstep. Things that are going on in the dark web, whether it's different planning efforts, different types of monetization of zero-day vulnerabilities, monetization of credential data, monetization of zero-day malware, so on and so forth. There are a lot of things that you need to understand from both a criminal ecosystem perspective as well as a dark web and hidden data perspective that are very valuable to your decision-making process. Notice that whether it's with cyber threat intelligence or digital risk monitoring, I bring everything back to your decision-making process. Your ability to make decisions is the most important thing that you have at your disposal. Your decision-making is what literally makes or breaks your organization. Your decision-making and your capacity to make good proactive decisions is what allows you to prevent yourself from being breached. Conversely, poor decision-making, based off incomplete information, based off a very poor understanding of the adversary, is what will lead you to make incorrect decisions. So again, think of this capability as something that enhances your decision making as it pertains to external threats. When you think about some of the benefits of digital risk protection, it protects you from some of the threats like I'm showing here, things that could threaten your brand awareness, things that could potentially affect your brand, things like credential harvesting, which are happening on an almost common base, on a constant basis. Remember what John said earlier, the amount of identity-based attacks that we're seeing is skyrocketing. Literally last year and the year before that, approximately 70% of breaches occurred due to identity-based reasons. And the logic behind that is very simple. When COVID-19 happened, guess what? Suddenly we all started working like I'm working in this room here, all remotely, nice and comfy in our own environments. But think about the implications of that. Your perimeter is no longer the firewall. Your perimeter is now the identity. So your ability to protect that critical perimeter, each and every employee within your organization, is premised upon your understanding to protect against things like credential harvesting. Obviously, things like intellectual property theft are huge. Employee and customer PII, that's another big one. Remember what I said earlier around data extortion? Most ransomware attacks these days now consist of a data extortion element to them. Your ability to combat data extortion and to understand data extortion is in many ways premised upon your visibility into that particular threat space, which again is what a capability like Falcon X Recon, which is our digital risk monitoring capability, will help you do. And then of course, supply chain threats, which are ever prevalent. The problem with a supply chain threat is you don't find out about it until it happens, but then when it happens, it's kind of too late. And I see this all the time, especially with third-party software supply chain vulnerabilities, whether it was SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange or Log4j. Literally what I see happening every single time one of these things happen is customers start panicking. They're like, oh no, oh no, oh, tell me about Log4j. Ooh, tell me about Microsoft Exchange. Tell me about SolarWinds. But the reality of the problem is that by the time that you find out about the attack that's happening, the adversary is already working on the next one. Therefore, it is incumbent upon you to prepare for the next one prior to having to have found out about it in the open source. My biggest recommendation to you across all of these different areas is behave as if it is happening right now, because surely it is. Behave as if the attack is happening against you right now. And what you will find is that you're able to get into this proactive decision-making model where you're no longer waiting for things to happen, but rather proactively engaging the adversary on your terms instead of their terms. Part of the challenge of monitoring the criminal underground is the complexity. Because here's the thing, we all know that criminals operate on the dark web, but if you right now, so like you, the viewer, if you right now had to go navigate the dark web and go figure out exactly where they were at and track them from place to place, would you be able to do it? Maybe, maybe not. I know I would certainly have a challenge doing it. If I did not have tools at my disposal, it would take a long time. And yeah, frankly, again, kind of like I said earlier, time is our most precious resource, right? So we need tools that allow us to save time and to do this in an efficient manner. One of the reasons for that is that it's constantly evolving. These actors are moving from forum to forum to forum. They're closing off different locations. They're finding ways to consistently find ways to, again, defeat our ability to monitor. It's difficult to track. So a lot of these sites are restricted. A lot of them require you to pay to enter. Some of them require you to talk your way in. And then even once you've talked your way in, then you have to maintain the persona. So most organizations are not really well positioned to do that. And then of course, let's say that you do get in, and let's say that you are able to track the adversary. Then the very simple question of that is, well, do you know what you're looking at that point? Okay, you're there, but do you know what to make of this data? Do you actually know how to action it and operationalize the data? So here's what I recommend in terms of a capability like this, especially if you're a Falcon Complete customer and you're enjoying the complete experience in terms of us managing your endpoint. I would consider something like Recon Plus. Recon Plus is basically our managed service as it pertains to digital risk monitoring. And what this service will do is first, it will create the monitoring rules for you based off the critical assets that the adversary is likely to attack within your environment. And then when those monitoring rules hit, they'll triage those rules in order to investigate and then prioritize which alerts are actual real alerts and which alerts are false alarms and therefore need to kind of go back into like the capable of. And that's the nice thing about Recon Plus is that we have all that background knowledge and we can tell rules for you to combat this stuff and actually stop it. So that's kind of, again, it goes back to saving time. It goes back to really harnessing that expertise. So that's certainly a big part of it. And then of course there's mitigation. So I mean, again, like when I think about intelligence, To me, intelligence needs to be actionable. It needs to have real life steps that I can take as a consumer in order to harden and make my organization more defensible. And that's a big part of this. We're going to give you recommendations that help you achieve that, not just tell you, hey, something bad happened, but rather, hey, here's this thing happening. Here's what we think this means. And then here are the potential implications it could have for your organization, which of course allude to here's what we should probably do about it. So here's a list of the different intelligence capabilities that we have. Like I said, we have two different types. The digital risk monitoring is the external. I call it cyber threat intelligence, but on this slide, it's called threat adversary intelligence. Think of that as the internal. Both paired together truly do make the most complete intelligence capability that I'm aware of as a vendor. So I do strongly encourage you to consider Crowdstrike if you are considering engaging in a more advanced threat intelligence function. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about threat hunting. And the premise of threat hunting goes back to not only the zero trust architecture, or actually, Scott, are we going over to you guys really quick first, or do you want me to keep going?
Nope,
Okay.
Keep going.
Yep. So the premise of threat hunting is the idea that nothing is perfect, that the adversary is very creative, very capable. They're going to find new and ingenious, well, not ingenious, but new and innovative ways in order to gain access to these target environments. Therefore, it is critical that we engage in threat hunting in order to combat these adversaries. Probably the best way to think of this is to think about, well, where does threat hunting fit into your operation? And one way to kind of visualize a variety of different tools, they're going to triage alerts, they're going to investigate alerts, so on and so forth. And you have a process that is designed to understand those known knowns. The purpose of threat hunting is to help you engage the unknown unknowns. And with any advanced adversary, whether it's Russian adversary types or some of these more advanced criminal types, your capacity to engage in advanced hunting operations is what's going to make or break an organization. Specifically, we would recommend engaging in 3 different hunting disciplines to include statistical analysis, which is looking for anomalies, as well as statistical trends, hypothesis testing, which is exactly how it sounds. It's basically using your understanding of threat actors and then testing different hypotheses against the environment, as well as retrospective analysis in order to deductively broken down how the SolarWinds attack occurred. And we use our understanding of that attack in order to now engage in hunting designed to find different types of supply chain compromises. So with using retrospective analysis, using intelligence to drive that allows us to be more proactive in the future for how we go after some of these more advanced threats. And again, the purpose here is to go after the unknown unknowns. This is really for your more advanced adversary types. So the two combined together are what allow you to have a more holistic security operation. When you think about a threat hunting capability, what it kind of boils down to is a combination of 3 things: data and visibility, human expertise, and then, of course, tools and techniques. And with the data and visibility, what it kind of boils down to here is you need to be able to see what you're hunting against. The human expertise, you need to have people with a variety of different perspectives, whether it's the nation state perspective or the criminal perspective, but also have 24/7 operations. And the reason I say 24/7 is that's also how the adversary operates. If you think about the Kaseya ransomware attack, which occurred in July 4th weekend last year, I promise you that was not a coincidence. That timing was very intentional, and our adversaries are very intentional in their timing. Therefore, 24/7 hunting is what's required to do that. And then, of course, tools and techniques in order to automate the process as well as make it more efficient. With CrowdStrike, we have a variety of hunting capabilities. Basically, we have Overwatch Standard and Overwatch Elite. Overwatch Standard enrolls you into our 24/7 hunting operation, where we inform you when we find different types of adversarial activity. Whereas Overwatch Elite is more of like a 2-way communication capability, where in addition to us informing you, you can also task us in terms of the types of hunts you would like to see. But then you also get like an intrusion intelligence perspective. So not only are they telling you what's happening in your environment, but Overwatch Elite is also telling you what's happening to your peers, so you can make more informed decisions about how you want to engage in some of the proactive defensive measures that I was talking about earlier. So back over, I think this is back over to you guys now.
Yeah, super. No, and it was a really valuable framework for dealing with a lot of the issues that we're looking at here. And I always appreciate a reference to an all-time great Donald Rumsfeld quote on the known unknowns and known unknowns. So John, this next recommendation from the report is eliminate misconfigurations. I know just from talking to you in past events that this is sort of a passion of yours. How do you go about eliminating misconfigurations, and how much of the of your security problems does that eliminate?
Well, I loved it when I heard Jason say that it's broken into the you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know, because you've heard me say before, Scott, that it's rarely what we know that gets us in trouble. It's what we don't know that gets us in trouble, right? And this isn't just cybersecurity. This is pretty much anything, but IT in general. If you knew that your network switch power supply was about to go bad, you would have replaced it. It wouldn't have gone bad and caused you to bring the entire network down right in the middle of the day while they were running payroll. You never would have let that happen. It's what you don't know. And what you don't know oftentimes comes down to misconfigurations. You got distracted and you didn't finish putting in those access control lists in your switches, or you didn't quite finish going through and smoke testing all of your policies in your firewall. Any of that, you didn't quite go through and make sure everybody was trained on the DLP, data loss prevention strategies that you have in place up in your cloud-based mail system, or any of those kind of things. So I feel, and have felt for a long time, that one of the lowest hanging pieces of fruit that's out there for us to both improve technical operations for our organization, and enhance our security posture is by investing resources to identify and eliminate misconfigurations. And a misconfiguration isn't just something that you have that is wrong, right? That you've accidentally or whatever reason chosen to set the wrong setting. A misconfiguration, in my mind, is simply anything that isn't configured optimally for your organization's goals. Okay, because at the end of the day, that's what it matters, is whatever your organization is, whether it be a education, government, commercial entity, whatever, that organization has specific goals that they want to reach. And if your technical systems, your IT systems, aren't configured optimally to meet them, then you have an opportunity there. And the current level of threats, and like Jason and I have been talking about, the surge that we're seeing currently, it's more important than ever, because the more you stress a chain, the more the weak link becomes apparent. So these misconfigurations in our switches, our endpoints, our firewalls, as they see the increase in stress brought by this onslaught of network scan and all these different types of things, those misconfigurations are going to become more exposed. And the problem in my mind is, when they become more exposed, they may become more exposed first to that threat actor. As Jason mentioned earlier, they're probably already in there trying to gain access, trying to find things out. So if they expose the misconfiguration and leverage it first before you notice it, now you have a problem, right? Because there's no guarantee that when a misconfiguration exposes itself, that you, not the attacker, will be the first to notice it, at least in my opinion.
And a considered opinion it is, yeah. And I like that. I like that chain analogy. So that is a great a great recommendation there about eliminating misconfigurations. And John, one more for us here, and just a note: we're about probably 10 minutes from the Q&A portion, so we've got a lot of great questions in there. But if you have any questions, now is the time to get them in there, and because we'll get to as many as we can. But the next one, John, I'm really interested in your take on this one. Is build a cybersecurity culture. What tips do you have as a CISO for successful techniques for building a cybersecurity culture?
So one of the biggest things I've been emphasizing this year and late last year is for the IT pros, the IT specialists, security specialists, the IT team, to spend a moment talking with the customer, those people that are using our IT systems, and explaining to them that the security practices that we're putting in place, the things that we're recommending that they don't do, the extra steps that we make them take to use multi-factor authentication, all those kind of things, have a conversation with them and explain to them that our whole motivation, or at least a big part of our motivation, is to protect them and their interests. Because, and this is a big one, and unfortunately, it's based on an actual event that I know of. 2 weeks before the Christmas holiday last year, 2021, manufacturing company that I'm familiar with was ransomed. Okay. And they were unable to complete payroll. So I want you to think about being one of those employees who went home 2 weeks before Christmas and was going to go out and do that last minute shopping and buy presents and everything else. And there was no money in your bank account because the direct deposit of your payroll check didn't go through. And to just add to that, maybe now you've been temporarily laid off because the company can't afford to pay you if they're not generating revenue. So while they figure out how to fix this event and bring their systems online, you're not earning a paycheck. And, for most companies, they think, well, they'll just give me a paper check. A company with 10,000 employees can't just write 10,000 payroll checks and have them for you today before your bank account starts bouncing auto payments and that kind of thing. So I tell that story because that resonates with people and helps them understand that cybersecurity is as much about protecting them who aren't in IT as it is about protecting us in IT, because the cybersecurity culture needs to permeate the entire organization. It doesn't just live in IT. It needs to be part of everyone that's part of the organization, including the C-suite and the board of directors. They have to understand that cybersecurity is about protecting their investment, protecting their assets, protecting the long-term viability of their business plan, right? Companies often spend a lot of investment in 5-year plans or 10-year plans. I'm sure Jason would agree with me here, but he's more welcome to correct me that a cybersecurity event can significantly alter how a 5-year plan goes forward. Right. So what I thought I was going to do for the next 5 years can totally be changed with one successful cyber attack against my organization. So that culture has to permeate up as well as down and throughout the organization. And that's my tip. I know I got a little long-winded there, but my tip is spend some time and explain to others, or at least try to have a conversation with them, letting them understand that this is about all of us, not just about IT.
Yeah, and you mentioned that story about the Christmas time paychecks. That certainly resonated with me. I mean, that would be awful. All right, so for our final two tips, I'm going to turn things over to Jason again, but one is stopping modern attacks, and number 9 is adopt zero trust. So, Jason, take it away.
So on the modern attack topic, we've been really alluding to the need for identity protection, and that's kind of how we're going to address this one, right? Like I said, and like John has been saying as well, literally about 70% of breaches have an identity related nexus to them. So it's incumbent upon us to really think about, well, how can we leverage capabilities that are going to help secure that new perimeter, which is the identity? Beyond the content on the slide, I'm going to really make this simple. Your identity capability should principally be able to do two things. The first is it needs a capacity to centrally issue multi-factor authentication. You need to be able to issue MFA to your different cloud devices, different applications, different areas of logging in, VPN, RDP, whatever it might be. You need this capacity to centrally issue multi-factor authentication. If you want the biggest and the hardest lesson learned from last year around that, go research Colonial Pipeline. Literally 50% of the oil to the eastern portion of the United States gone for a few days, obviously not permanently, but literally 50% of the oil production capacity that goes to the eastern half of the United States was hit because of lack of MFA. So that's the first big part. The second big part of what your capability should be able to do is to challenge the authorization of the adversary based off the roles of the users. This is a critical one. This is something that's going to help you stop the attacks that come as a result of supply chain vulnerabilities. This is going to help you deal with zero-day vulnerabilities, because if your users have limited role-based permissions, what that means is that if an adversary gets into your environment, let's say they compromise one of your users, if that user's role-based permissions do not allow them to go to Active Directory or do not allow them to go to other sensitive parts of the network, that is another form of restriction and control that you can levy against the adversary. So I would strongly encourage you to consider identity capabilities that allow you to do that. And then the last one is to really consider a layered zero defense strategy. I'm very intentional in my wording. Zero trust is not a technology. I cannot sell you a zero trust. What we can certainly do, though, is talk about a strategy that will help you enable zero trust. And what it ultimately boils down to is zero trust is about protecting data. That data exists between your people, your endpoint devices, your servers, and the cloud. Amongst those four things, I would argue that that constitutes your information environment. And if you are a cybersecurity professional, which is pretty much all of us, then your job is to protect that data from the adversary. And the layered defense strategy is designed to defeat the adversary and engage the adversary at every single layer. The outermost layer of how you can engage them is threat intelligence. You already heard my tirade on threat intelligence, so I'm not going to go into it again. But again, what it boils down to, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to kind of know who the adversary is before you make any other decisions. You heard me say earlier that the identity is the new perimeter. You need to be able to issue MFA so you can protect the people layer of the identity. We also need to be able to challenge the adversary's authorization. Their ability to operate freely in our servers as well as our cloud environment needs to be challenged at every step. We need to aggressively remediate vulnerabilities on our endpoint operating systems, our workloads and servers, as well as our cloud applications. We need to engage in prevention as well as have insight on how different alerts and how different adversarial behaviors are affecting our network. We particularly need to have that visibility on our endpoint devices as well as our server environment. However, like every big company, a lot of us are migrating to the cloud. In many ways, it's more efficient, and in some cases, based off the nature of the arrangement, it can even be more secure. But what that means is that we have to secure the cloud, and things like cloud workload protection are critical for us to do that. Part of the solution is data logging. So our ability to detect some of these more advanced attacks is going to be premised upon our ability to audit the large amounts of data and look for anomalies. A good example of this is a supply chain attack. Probably the best way for you to detect and defeat a supply chain attack is to engage in prolonged auditing of third-party software updates. Let me be more specific here. In the ideal world, you are taking a third-party software update, you are logging those updates, and you are asking a very simple question. How did the software behave before the update? And then how did the software behave after the update? If the software is behaving very strangely after the update, like lots of outbound DNS and lots of inbound HTTP, which might be abnormal for the software, then perhaps that might indicate something like a supply chain attack. However, your ability to log the data and look back in time to detect these anomalies is critical for your capacity to do that. Again, you heard me say earlier about the need for threat hunting. The adversary is smart. They're very well trained, very well paid. They will, if they try hard enough, they will get in. And having a 24/7 threat hunting capability is your capacity to stop them. The adversary is also seeking to exfiltrate data from your environment. So having data loss protection capabilities that allow you to have that data be encrypted should they exfiltrate it from your environment is a good step. Services and having incident response retainers is obviously important. And then, of course, for a more managed experience, we have Falcon Complete. But notice that none of these things in of themselves, by themselves, is the answer. And I'm not even saying that this is the complete answer. There's a lot of things that we currently don't do. Email gateway solutions, IDS, IPS, a lot of the network-based capabilities. Crowdstrike currently doesn't have a lot of those things. So like I said, I cannot sell you a zero trust technology. I can help contribute to your strategy, but ultimately it is your strategy. And I would challenge you to adopt some form of a strategy as you're going into this next year. Over to you, Scott.
All right, super. Yeah, and so let's take some audience questions at this point. First one comes from Paul, who's wondering what threat type, like ransomware, DDoSing, etc., is the most urgent threat to emerge from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Are the dueling sides of cyber warriors showing signs of inflicting collateral damage on other IT infrastructure? You guys touched on this a bit, but have there been any really high-profile spillover events?
So I said earlier that we observed a few destructive capabilities. The first one that we observed as part of this conflict is something called Whispergate, which happened around January 15th, right after the diplomatic talks. Whispergate was a ransomware capability, but the weird thing about Whispergate was it looked like ransomware, but it didn't behave like effective ransomware. So for example, it irreversibly corrupts the stuff that it encrypts, which is like the opposite of ransomware. You want to be able to decrypt ransomware. But then beyond that, it also left a ransom note telling you to pay to a Bitcoin address, but leaving it in open text, which again is very atypical of what most ransomware actors do these days. Most ransomware actors will direct you to a private website. That way the FBI and CrowdStrike and all the other security researchers aren't watching what the actor is doing. So that's one capability that we saw being leveraged. We also saw a capability called Drive Slayer, which appears to be exclusively a wiper capability without ransomware functionality built into it, but just purely designed to destroy data. We saw another one called Party Ticket, which we weren't able to attribute necessarily back to Russia, but it kind of behaved like Drive Slayer, but then has more of the ransomware functionality built back into it. Probably my best recommendation, though, honestly, is like, here's the thing: if you're focusing on the ransomware and the destructive capabilities, Russia is a very sophisticated actor. They're going to use a lot of new stuff, and if you're using something like CrowdStrike or another next gen provider, they're going to do the prevention. You guys need to focus on the access stuff. Stop them from getting access. So again, it's that three-step model: access, post-exploitation, execution. Fight the adversary at all three levels, specifically on the access portion. That's my biggest advice on that one.
You know, in on that note of you know, Russia being sophisticated, Tatiana has a question. What country has the most sophisticated hackers? An interesting question. What's your take from all the reporting that you guys do?
Well, I guess it depends on whether you mean like malicious nation states or just everybody. Because if I had to say which country had the most effective ones, I would say the United States, probably also Israel. But in terms of actual adversary, you know, nation states that are behaving in an adversarial manner. And when I say behaving in an adversarial manner, I mean attacking the private sector, which the United States and Israel certainly do not do. But for those, probably Russia. And it's not even a close second. Like there's Russia all the way over here, and then like kind of getting closer to them, but really still far away is North Korea, China behind them, and then Iran behind China. If I were to rate the top four, I'd probably do something that's probably that way.
Interesting. Um, Question from Justin. You know, this relates to some of the points that you were making earlier, Jason. But Justin's asking, how do you safely keep your ear to the dark web or the underground to try and stay as you know, ahead, you know, as much ahead as you possibly can? You know, obviously you guys have offerings for that, but are there sort of dangers to doing it yourself? Like, can you um, cause problems that you didn't have before if you start poking around
I think if you are
in those?
Yeah, if you're purely in an observation mode, I don't really believe you can cause problems per se. It's when you start communicating and talking and buying and whatever, right? Revealing identities, that is where it kind of gets a little bit more dicey. But honestly, like the biggest first step that you can take is kind of actually knowing what you're looking for. There's a lot of organizations that I'll talk to be like, "Yeah, I want to monitor the dark web." I'm like, "Okay, why?" Oh, I don't know. I went to RSA one time and I saw a thing about this, or my CISO said I had to. But like the amount of organizations that I sometimes talk to who actually don't know why they're doing things is astounding. And the challenge, of course, is if you don't know why you're doing it, well then okay, what are you going to monitor for? Are you looking for particular things? Like what is the issue, right? So really focusing on your critical assets and kind of honing in your expectations of what you are looking for, I would say is the first critical step in that.
Okay, super. And probably have time for one more question. I want to ask one that's from. Well, I'm going to kind of combine two questions. So we have questions from Anita and one from Todd. You know, and Anita's saying they're a small shop, you know, and everything is in the cloud. And Todd is asking, what's your general recommendation for the resource needs to manage the threats specifically with your tool? So I guess the way I would combine that is, you know, what kind of resource needs does a company have in terms of personnel, you know, to effectively consume what CrowdStrike is you know, telling you? And you know, is there a sweet spot in terms of like, do you need to be a certain size company, you know, to really consider it?
Yeah, I mean, I think CrowdStrike intentionally designs itself to serve customers of all types and sizes, as well as of all types of maturity. I think the foundation, though, regardless of your size, regardless of the amount of funding you may or may not have, is still actually the threat landscape. So, like, if you're going to buy something, well, why are you buying it? Which things are you going to go after? What actually makes sense for you? Uh, Certainly focusing on threats that are most likely to affect your interests are big ones, right? So, I mean, again, if you had to prioritize, certainly your endpoint environment, that's the very beginning. I would argue that, like, you kind of want to have this inside out perspective. The heart and soul of your organization is the endpoint, But then how is the endpoint access? Okay, maybe through the identity. Okay, but then what are the different areas? Maybe there's vulnerability management, maybe threat intelligence is more external to that. So it's kind of like taking your critical assets and what you need to guard your critical assets first, focusing on that, and then slowly working your way outwards based off your unique threat landscape, as well as the probability and impact that adversary may have on that threat landscape. But again, it comes back to your understanding of what that landscape is before you make any decisions.
Okay, super. And as I mentioned, we're running out of time. I did put the poll up here. If you'd like additional information from CrowdStrike, of various types, be great to know what you'd be interested in, and we can be sure to get you that. But Jason, just if somebody wants to get started with CrowdStrike or find out more, what do you recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely there's a portal like on the CrowdStrike portal itself. If you're an interested customer, you can just navigate to the CrowdStrike area where you can fill out a little form and we'll contact you. Also, there's like, let's say you just want to send an email and get directly in touch with somebody like we'll get you to my team. So let's say you want to have like a Russia-Ukraine threat brief, or you want to have a ransomware threat brief. You can email one of these two addresses and we'd be able to do that. Or alternatively, like I said, if you're more interested in a product conversation, just go to the CrowdStrike website and fill out that form, and we'll get in touch with you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, with that, I want to thank both of you guys for coming on. This has been a fantastic conversation, just really informative, and I've learned a lot. I think that everybody on this call has learned a lot. John, Jason, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
So the winner of the $300 Amazon gift card is Mike Montero from Massachusetts. So congratulations to Mike. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank CrowdStrike for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all your great questions today. That concludes today's event. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next time.